Okay, here we are again in 11f, and this time we're at Ephesians 1:6. Let me move it down a little bit. We had stopped. I want to keep that lower 28 in there. Hopefully I can. Yeah, okay. We had stopped and we were talking about how pregnant a time this is, and I keep using the word pregnant, and now I'm going to explain why. You'll notice that we had closed in 11e saying that this was a nexus, the two sevens, beginning and ending, fat and lean, dividing off periods, entry and close. Okay, that's a constant theme in the Bible. And you're beginning, I hope, to see that this use of numbers is a very deft way of saying a lot with very little. And that was important to these people because they memorized scripture orally. All right, so that they could be walking to Ephesus or grinding grain or whatever and could mull over very quickly the numbers to get the meaning, because you're busy doing something and you want to be able to think and walk at the same time. So if you really were inculcated with the numbers, which you were because you were, had to count the syllables, you became pretty good at math, and you became pretty good at metaphors. And the numbers are basically metaphors for doctrines. Hopefully you're beginning to see that now. Okay, well, notice this metaphor. You got a 28 and a 14. That adds up to 42. 42 in the Bible is used for generation building. Okay, and remember we were talking about nexus. Okay, 28 and 14 is 42 in this direction, and then 14 and 28 is a new generation in that direction. It's palindromic. And that, hopefully you saw, is a big feature of Psalm 90, is all these palindromes. You got 21s going on here. Okay, that's 42. So we have a generation building going on between that 21 and that 21. It's benchmarking a generation building. Okay, and then we got a whole generation being built here in this double 21. Okay, yeah, because this is the end of the Adamic voting period, and this is the beginning of the Noahic voting period. So they're piggybacked. Okay, this is the Noahic voting period. This is the Adamic voting period. And yeah, a generation got produced from Adamic. This is the end of the Adamic. And here's the beginning of the Noahic. You see how clever this is? Just by use of numbers. Clever numbers. 42. One generation passes the torch to the next. And that's exactly what you got going on here with Ephesians. Okay? He's doing the same thing that was done since Moses. Palindromic. Here's a generation ending and a generation beginning. And that generation, of course, begets another generation, which goes here. And you'll notice he's doing a 28 again. No more 21s and 7s. He's doing a 28. But they add up to 42. Now, he's really been doing this all along. I just didn't call your attention to it before. Okay? Right here, 56. That's two generations. That's two 28s. See that? So 28 is shorthand for 21 plus a sort of tribulation-like period. And when you got two of them, you got a 14 in between. See how this is working? So now look. Paul is the second generation from Christ. Actually, it's the first generation because he's born during the time that Christ was alive. He was a student of Gamaliel, and since he was 14. And so he is the same generation as Christ, but he sees Christ post-cross on the Damascus Road, which I'm sure you know about in the Acts. Okay, but he's writing to the second generation. He's writing to Gentiles, specifically Greeks, in their language, in their style, using their terms. Okay, so he's positioning this as the second generation, because that's who they are. And that's how he's going to close, his letter. Let me turn off the air conditioning. I'm sorry, I thought I did that. It's going to make up too much noise. Okay, so he's writing to them as the second generation, which is how he's going to close this passage. So they're the second generation. And then, let me make sure I'm recording. Yes, I'm recording. And then, this is third generation. This is fourth generation. And as you know, probably from the Bible, hopefully you know about this, you got 4 generations and then it starts over. You've heard of the 4-generation curse? So this is the 4th generation being cursed. We talked about the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and we're going to talk about it again. But at the same time, there's a 4th generation, there's a 5th generation growing up. And the reason for the 4th generation curse is so that the 5th generation can be free of the religiosity and start to grow normally. Okay? It happens in families, it happens in regions, it happens in whole countries. Alright? And basically what happens here is that you got the Bar Kokhba revolution causing the diaspora of everybody in Jerusalem. The Christians leave, the Jews leave, because it becomes a pagan town. Alright? It becomes a pagan town, so pretty much everybody leaves. Well, that means they're going somewhere else. That means their kids are going to be born somewhere else. 5th generation begins at this point. Alright? It starts here. And the 4th generation, of course, having left, they're going to be growing up in a new era. They're going to be growing up in a new area. They're going to not have the heavily, what do you want to call it? Apostate influence is not going to be the same anymore. They're going to have to rethink everything. They're going to have to start depending on God because they're going to be in a strange place. So then their kids aren't going to have that baggage. So Paul is using a generation, a new generation. Well, that's pregnancy, right? That's also what 91 means. Okay, and I'm going to get into that because this now we have to go back to Noah. My computer is slowing down. Let's hope it doesn't tank. Okay, so you have a new generation going here. Nexus, end of one, start of another, due here to Bar Kokhba. That causes a diaspora to occur. Okay? Now, this particular thing I had said was Paul referencing Moses and Daniel and Isaiah. Syllable 133 in Isaiah, which I'm not going to show, is Isaiah 53:2 at the end. It says, "No sight of him will we desire." Okay, I think in your English translations it says something like, "We didn't find him attractive," or some equivalent. Okay, that's not really what the Hebrew says. But it's Isaiah 53:2, so you can locate yourself there. That's syllable 133 in Isaiah. Okay, syllable 133 in Hebrew takes us back to, takes us back to right up here in the Adamic voting period. And this verse says in Hebrew that we spend all of our days in your anger, and we end our days, or in your wrath, we are apoplectic. Okay, that's Psalm 90 verse 7. You'll have a similar translation. Okay, so Paul's benchmarking this particular place in Psalm 90. Alright, and then in Daniel was also benchmarking Psalm 90 in that place, and that's at Daniel 9:7, and this whole verse basically says, "Hi God, to you is righteousness, and to us is we're shamefaced, no matter where we are in Israel, near and far, wherever you have dispersed us." It's a verse about diaspora. And in Daniel's timeline that he's following sotto voce here, he's talking about the Solomonic period. Okay, from Solomon to Asa. And I cover that in the links to the, this is hard to explain. I cover that in the links in the Psalm 90, page 5 of page 5 of this document is going to have the link to it, where I talk about how Daniel is referencing, every single verse. But the point that you've just seen, even if you don't understand it, you get the idea that Paul is benchmarking to specific syllables that are related to the historical time. Okay, in Psalm 90, it's related to the time of the Adamic voting period, talking about how everybody's dying in God's anger, and they themselves are angry at God. Okay, in Daniel, he's saying that everybody in Israel is guilty, whether they're in diaspora or not. And of course, this is a passage about church history, about us going into a kind of diaspora, because Israel, Jerusalem in particular, is going to get raised at this point. And that raising is going to raise a new generation outside of all of that religiosity. So that's how God makes this 14 a turning point and generates a new fifth generation. You had generation 1 up here and generation 2. Generation 3, including the 7, generation 4, and here's generation 5 starting over. Okay? And they get sent into diaspora in order to retrench and begin a 6th generation here that is free of. Okay, they themselves are the ones that are, put into diaspora. And they end up having a freedom as a result. And then they beget. And then I was saying that's related to 91 in pregnancy. Well, think about this for a minute. 9 months, we all know, is human pregnancy. It's technically 280 days. Well, 9 times 30 is 270 days, plus a week. So, 9.1 months. 91, the Lord would have been 91, should have been 91 when what? When the original schedule for under the old Daniel schedule for the tribulation to begin, the Lord should have been, beginning his 91st year at that time. It's also evocative of pregnancy. You with me on this? You see how clever these numbers are? And then when you're reading the verse and you got all this behind it, it's like, ooh, this has a lot of meaning. Okay. Then there's another meaning to it. A year has 4 quarters. Each quarter is approximately 90 days. The end of a day in Jewish time begins the new day at sundown. So it's a 90 and it's a 91 all at once. Just like your 91st year begins on your 90th birthday. So there's an ending and a beginning. It's palindromic. Generation, ending, generation, beginning. NEXUS. An ending and a beginning. A turning point. You see all this irony, this wordplay? Okay? All inside a few verses that on the surface just sound churchy. And resulting in the praise of his glory. Well, it means a lot more than that, doesn't it? He's telling you, this is how his glory of his grace works. It births. It's judgment right here. Bar Kokhba rebellion results in everybody, getting hurt. And the raising of Jerusalem, and prisoners, and rape, and pillage, and loss of goods, and loss of life. And at the same time, it's like, a forest burns a lot of times. A forest burns in order to make way for new growth. Same thing here. 91, pregnancy. Pregnancy is not a happy time for a woman. Okay? And it's the first quarter of a year. And what is the first quarter of a year, at least by our modern standards? It's like winter. It's only at the end of the quarter that spring comes. See all these meanings? And so here you are, you're thrashing wheat, or you're walking to Ephesus, or you're standing in line, and you can ponder beneath these words all this numerical metaphor telling you the context of these words. See, it's like grace. Well, what is grace? Well, grace is a birthing. Grace is also judgment. And it gives birth. And see, and look at this. Within the beloved, a pregnancy. Okay? They're going into diaspora here. This is not a happy time for the people living between 133 and 140 AD. They're under persecution by Trajan. Trajan and Pliny were exchanging letters about how to kill the Christians. Alright, and then you had Antoninus Pius, and then you had Marcus Aurelius. And this is all, they're being persecuted. And they're being snotty, and that's why they're part of the reason why they're being persecuted. And then you have the, Jerusalem being raised here. All not nice. And on top of that, the Christians are fighting with each other, and the Jews are fighting with each other. And everybody's trying to gain political dominance within their own sects. Meanwhile, God's executing judgment, and that's the glory of His grace too. And He's gracing us out, and we're being flooded, remember? This was, I hope this works. This was syllable 133 in the Adamic voting period. Psalm 90 verse 7. Okay? All of our days end in your anger. Because remember, the flood was predicted during Adam's day. That was Enoch. There was a 1,000-year prediction about the flood. Methuselah means when he dies, the flood happens. Okay? And there's a flood that's happening at the time that Paul's talking about. People are being flooded out by troops. A flood of troops takes over Jerusalem. The second time, after Titus, 70 years after Titus. And then there's a rebirth. And that's the first quarter of a year of church. Bleak. The shepherd is hit. The sheep are scattered. He has just one group of apostles who he appointed personally. Paul being appointed on the Damascus Road. The others seeing the risen Christ, as Paul explains in both Galatians and 1 Corinthians 15. And then there isn't anybody else. So it's bleak. So then there's all this political gamesmanship, everybody trying to claim the apostolic mantle. So this is the winter, the first 3 months of the year of church, which is obviously taking place over 150 years. You see the cleverness of this? Okay? Pregnancy, 9.1 months. New generation occurs. 28, 14. Which Matthew plays on in Matthew 1's genealogy. That's why it's 42s. Because that's Isaiah 52:13 through 14 is 42 syllables, and that's the generation from David that Isaiah is playing on. So that's why Matthew picks it up. And so that begets another 42 right here. You see? And so ends the first quarter of church. And it's a nexus, 14, giving birth to the next 28. And again, it's a whole 28. He's not subdividing it anymore. Okay, now I want you to notice something else. You got a 56 here, and then he's made this whole next section a 91 pregnancy. It's as if the Lord, the Lord is 56 here. He is pregnant waiting for church to be born. And of course the actual text is telling us that this was all eternity past, what God purposed for church. So we were pregnant in Him in eternity past. You see the tie? You see how you keep on, through the numbers, these same words keep on having additional meanings that you wouldn't know if you didn't know the meter. It's got a lot more meaning to it than what you could just read in a translation. There's all this dimension to the text that you don't even know about because you don't know the meter. So here we are, pregnant in Christ in eternity past, because that's what this whole text is about, Father's purpose in eternity past. Okay? See, He foreordained. That's the whole theme of this section. And it ends up being a 91 for pregnancy. 9.1 months. Okay? And at the same time, since it's playing out post-cross, it's the first quarter of church represented by 147 years, which at this point is 5 generations. This is the 5th generation. Okay? Now, the other thing that He's doing is that you'll notice this is 28. Alright? And this adds up to 63. 21, 28, and 14. So now look at the next page. 28. And then now He suddenly puts the 7 back here. Because if you say 28, 56, and 7 is 63. So we got a repeat of what was up here. Same values. 28, 63. Differently configured because they're different groups of people. But the same result. 28 and 63. Now, that means that, here we had in our first group, this one was a little more positive because he's emphasizing 21s as temple building. So he's saying some really, people got built here. And then we had a low point with the 7. And then we have to resort to 28. But that's going to be a new generation, so it's going to be a turning point. But at the same time, this is a 28. This is 63. 63 means vote short. In other words, church is not complete. And that same trend continues here, but it's slightly differently configured. 28 vote short. But now it's 56 very short and a 7. The 7 means that time almost ends. And He introduces the assets, which we're going to cover in the next segment, are even higher. We all have these assets. I mean, the text is telling us we all have these assets. But He ends up telling us that the use of these assets will be better, even though the time is worse. And at the same time, it's the same trend, continuing again, because it's a 63 and 28. In other words, a repeat. 28, 63. So time is the same, and time is getting better, and time is getting worse. And it's all a pregnancy, because that's first quarter. Pregnancy, 9.1 months. 91, playing on what should have been. See, because any time it can be the rapture. Any time can be a 91. They were expecting a 91, they were disappointed. Okay, well, the 91 really continues. And it has the same trends. My pastor stressed this over and over, but he didn't know the meter. Here we're proving it through the meter. 28, 63. Again, 28, 63, and that is still 91, so the rapture can still happen at any time. That's why he's doing it as 91s. There's another reason he's doing it as 91. 91 equals 70 plus 21. 70, as we saw in Psalm 90, is a voting period that had been set. Okay, that was God's decree. Here was the first voting period, the Adamic voting period, and that's a sum of 70 syllables. This is the Noahic voting period. That was a sum of 70 syllables through verse 11. And then Moses' own voting period, the historical voting period that ended 6 years before the Exodus, which is verses 12 through 15. So 70 is a voting period in history that plays 490 plus 70 plus 490, which I cover on pages 3 and 4 of the Ephesians 1 reparse document. Okay? So you can look on page 3 of the document and you can see this all summarized. Okay, so 70 plus 21, 21 is temple building, equals 91. 70 stands for voting completion, which Paul is basically saying isn't happening yet, because this is a 63, not a 70. Okay, so church isn't finished yet because there's no 70. Alright, and then you got 21, and 7 sort of stands for low period, tribulation, quality, time. And 21 is temple building. So 21 plus 70 is 91. So he's saying that the voting, the 70-year voting period and temple building is what the 91 also stands for. Now there's one more thing. I'm sorry to keep doing this to you, but I'm trying to show how rich these numbers are and what they add to the understanding of the text. Okay? 21 is also the number of jubilees in a 1050-year period. Now, Jubilee always stood for the voting by the unbeliever. The unbeliever being able to vote to know God. The unbeliever being able to vote to know the gospel. The unbeliever being able to vote to believe in Christ is bought by the 70-year period of believers voting. So if we're voting badly, then God has to punish us so that we will still be alive to vote, so that the unbeliever can vote. See, this is temple building for us, but it's also voting period for the unbeliever for a whole 1050. He gets to live because we do. So that's why you have when a Bar Kokhba rebellion occurs, and you have believers that are Christian and believers who are Jewish, not representing Christ properly. Well, God's got to do something about that. And that is glory of His grace too. Because that way, the whole 1050, the 21 Jubilees, the unbeliever gets a chance to vote, continuing chance to vote, so that this new generation can be a new generation of believers. People believing. Debt cancellation was paid for by everybody. And therefore the pregnancy continues. And therefore the trend is still 28 and 63, because not everybody has yet been born who's going to be in church. So I think I'll leave you on that to mull it over. I'm sorry that there's so much, it's kind of like mind-boggling how these numbers have so much significance. But I hope you're beginning to see that it's deliberate. I hope you're beginning to see that it's a cross-referencing system. I hope you're beginning to see that these words on the surface, when you figure out the meter, there's a lot more meaning there to mull over. It's not just words you say in church. Until the next time, ta-ta.